Tron is a landmark film that was truly innovative in its approach to visuals and the use of computer graphics in mainstream film. In fact, several animation studios, Pixar among them, often credit Tron as one of the foundational films in the development of computer graphics and media. Narratively, Tron's greatest strengths are in its world-building and thematic elements, where questions about oppression, resistance, and human existence in a digital world are breached in interesting ways.
You're in trouble, program. Make it easy on yourself.
In fact, there are many parallels that could be drawn thematically between Tron and The Matrix, with Kevin Flynn sharing a lot of character development moments and thematic representation with Neo. However, while the themes and world building are quite strong, the character and plot elements were slightly weaker, and I will talk about each of these aspects in greater detail throughout this video.
Bring in the logic probe!
That said, my in-depth review of Tron is now going to be covered in 7 parts. Part 1 is going to look at the plot, Part 2 is going to look at characters, Part 3 is world building, and then Part 4 is themes. Parts 1 through 4 will also be rated on a scale from 1 to 10, and here is a lexical representation of that scale. Now, moving on, Part 5 is going to look at the architects of the film. Then in Part 6, I'm going to talk a little bit about the financial and critical performance of Tron, and finally in Part 7 I will wrap everything up with my conclusion and final rating of the film. Now, with all that said, let's get the show on the road. Part 1. Plot. This film seems to follow a basic 3-act structure, so I'm going to analyze each act separately. So, starting with Act 1, this covers the opening of the film up to the moment when Kevin Flynn is pulled into the digital world. The opening act was strong, with each scene providing either background on the main conflict, important character development, or vital world-building information. For example, the film opens on someone playing the light cycle game to a transition into the grid where we immediately learn about the games and the way in which the Master Control Program, or MCP, is using oppressionary tactics to assimilate the other programs. This effectively sets up Sark and the MCP, what the MCP is trying to do, and the internal conflict on the grid. We then immediately shift to Flynn working on his computer to try and search for some information hidden in the grid, and using Clue to do it. This scene sets up Flynn as a programmer, while also highlighting how the program he wrote, Clue, manifests on the grid with Flynn's image, essentially establishing how there are parallel representations of each of the primary characters in real life and on the grid, and that these manifestations take on their creators' images.
Forget it, Mr. High and Mighty Master Control!
For the sake of brevity, I will briefly speak about the function of each of these successive scenes in the first act, but the important thing to note is that each successive scene continues to work in these ways, establishing the character, the world, and the conflict in an effective way. So following Flynn's hacking scene, the MCP traps Clue, assimilates the program, and summons Dillinger, which establishes the primary conflict. Flynn is looking for information in the system, and that information is something Dillinger needs to remain hidden. It also informs the audience that the MCP is beginning to assimilate more and more programs, and that Dillinger is working at the whim of the MCP rather than the other way around.
Thank you, Master Control.
The next scene cuts to Alan searching for his Tron program, only to realize he cannot access it and is summoned to Dillinger's office. This scene sets up what Tron is, Alan's motivation and role as a programmer, and that this role puts him firmly in a position antagonistic to both Dillinger and the MCP. Tron's purpose as a program is to monitor all contacts between Incom systems and the other systems, shutting down anything that's not scheduled. The MCP is actively trying to assimilate programs from other systems, which is further highlighted when Alan is dismissed and the MCP gets angry with Dillinger for allowing the creation of the Tron program to happen. The MCP concludes the meeting by explaining its plans to hack into the Pentagon and the Kremlin, which indicates that the MCP had developed beyond Dillinger's ability to regulate. Following this, we move into a scene in the laser room where we learn how matter is transferred into a program in the system, which is important for what will happen with Flynn at the end of the act, and it also establishes the relationship between Laura and Walter, as well as the relationship between Laura and Alan. Alan ends this bit by explaining how his access has been cut, which leads Laura to suggesting they go talk to Flynn on the assumption that he's the one trying to hack into Incom's system.
Come on, you scuzzy data, be in there.
The intro into Flynn's arcade then establishes Flynn's video game prowess, and then we learn the background information for the primary conflict of the film. Flynn was one of Incom's most talented programmers, and he started spending some of his extra time developing video games. Dillinger found the files for the video games, stole them, and then presented them to Incom as his own ideas. Furthermore, it seems that Dillinger's theft of the video game ideas is what led to his steep and sudden rise at Incom. Thus, Flynn is hacking into Incom to try and find evidence of Dillinger's theft. At the end of this scene, Alan, Laura, and Flynn decide to break into Incom and work together to find the information about the games Dillinger stole.
Shall we dance?
This is straightforward as a conflict, but there are two potential issues here. First, Dillinger notes in the next scene that Incom has accounts in 30 countries working on new defense systems. They are also making an incredibly complex laser system to turn living matter into computer programs. Now, we have to reconcile this image of the company with the narrative note that Dillinger's proposal for a few video games is what led to his meteoric rise at Incom. This is set in 1982. Video games in the 2000s may have become a massive money-making enterprise, but in 1982, it's a little hard to connect the idea that the development of a few arcade games would lead to someone rising to the top position in a tech company dealing in lasers and military defense programs.
I don't believe this.
The second potential problem is the MCP tells Dillinger it has located the file and was trying to assimilate it. The information basically boils down to who, how, and when the video game files were taken. This seems like data that could be easily erased. It's not overly complicated. One assumption you might make here is the MCP keeps it to hold over Dillinger, which does take place when the MCP tells Dillinger its plans to hack into the Pentagon. One might also assume the MCP is not deleting the information because it, like the other programs represented in the film, bears some temperamental similarities with its creator, namely Dillinger, and that it's holding on to the files because Flynn would have to go through the MCP to get a hold of the data, and the MCP arrogantly assumes it could never lose to Flynn. Either way, the crux of the film resting on the idea that Flynn developed some video games, Dillinger stole them, and this allowed Dillinger to become a senior VP at a tech company dealing in defense systems, and now, an AI able to hack into the Pentagon can't seem to delete basic information related to who developed the video games is a little weak.
Difficult proposition.
But getting back to the plot, we cut from the three protagonists to a scene between Walter and Dillinger talking about the programmers being denied access to the programs. The most pivotal moment in this scene, and potentially one of the most important lines of the film, comes from Walter here.
You know, you can remove men like Alan and me from the system, but we helped create it. And our spirit remains in every program we design for this computer.
This tiny line of dialogue highlights an incredibly important moment of thematic and world-building development for this film because it provides the basis of how and why certain programs resist assimilation, as well as how and why the programs would be so loyal to their users. Finally, we cut to Flynn, Alan, and Laura breaking into Incom, Laura leading Flynn to her computer, and Flynn attempting to hack into the Incom system. Flynn needed to use Laura's computer to stay off the security monitors, but it also placed him directly in the path of the laser. Now, some might see this as a contrivance, but it seems logical that Laura would assume the MCP wasn't capable of activating the laser on its own, or that the laser wasn't capable of doing this to a human at the stage of development they were at.
Sounds good.
Overall, the first act of the film was good. The pacing for the majority was tight, with nearly every scene contributing in some way to the development of either the characters, world building, or themes. The weak points are some of the small details that flesh out the primary conflict, which I highlighted previously, and the pacing in a few of the scenes. An example of the pacing issue is in the laser scene. I think the potential reason the scene was drawn out a bit is because it was shot in the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and the Incom laser bay was the target area for the Shiva solid-state multi-beam laser. And this was the first film shot inside that lab, and they were likely trying to showcase it a bit. Still, the act overall did a good job establishing all the crucial story elements, so it gets an 8.
Beautiful!
Moving on to Act 2, the second act was not quite as strong as the first, though there were several good moments that escalated the conflict and further developed both the world building and the digital versions of some characters we meet in Act 1. The first scene introduces Flynn to the grid, and, from his POV, some basics about the conflict inside the system. This shifts to a back and forth between Sark, which is the program represented by Dillinger, and the MCP, and how to deal with Flynn, and we learn that Sark has some hesitation about killing a user. This scene adds further information into Sark's role in the world of the grid, how he is subordinate to the MCP in this world as well, and contributes to building the relationship between users and programs in the grid. This moves into a scene establishing the grid rules, the use of the discs, and Flynn gets into his first battle. This bit adds important details about the MCP's oppressionary tactics, which is to basically force programs to either assimilate or be deleted, and that the grid is used in a way similar to gladiatorial combat. Flynn then gets a glimpse of Tron, learns that Tron fights for the users, and then Flynn is thrust into his first game where he is forced to fight another program rather than one of the MCP programs. Flynn is on the brink of winning, but hesitates and ultimately refuses when he realizes that winning would mean killing the other program.
Kill him.
Sark finishes the program off and is tempted to kill Flynn, but eventually decides not to because the MCP wanted Flynn to die in the games fairly. This scene again builds on the primary conflict of the grid and the stakes of participating in these games and what it means for the other programs. It also continues to develop both Flynn and Sark as characters, showing that Flynn was willing to play the game until he realized the actual stakes. And Sark's emotionally volatile reaction shows that he recognizes the threat Flynn's presence represents and also that he was, as the MCP noted at the outset of Act 1, steadily becoming more cruel. This portion wraps up with Flynn meeting Alan's program, Tron, and the idea of taking down the MCP is established as a shared goal between them. Thus, this interaction puts the two main forces together that are needed to resolve the primary conflict. Up to this point, the act had been relatively strong. Sadly, it begins to get a bit weaker past this, and much of the remainder of this act suffers from poor pacing and several scenes that do not significantly progress any vital aspects of the story. We shift first to the light cycle battle, where Flynn, Tron, and Ram defeat their opponents and ultimately escape. While this scene is fun to watch, the problem that emerges is that Tron is the one that leads the enemy bike into the wall that creates the hole they escape from. Had it been Flynn that did this, one could connect his knowledge from having written the light cycle program with knowing where weak points might be, but because Tron does it without having any kind of conversation with Flynn about it, one is left wondering if this is, in fact, the first time a bike has crashed into the wall and caused this kind of problem. Furthermore, it's incredibly convenient that the spot they crashed into just so happened to be connected to an escape route out of the game's area.
You shouldn't be able to do that.
This scene also does a bit of world building damage that isn't strictly on the director, but due to notes from Disney which urged them to change the color scheme of the programs and the MCP drones. Through most of the film, the free programs are represented in blue and the MCP programs are red. The light cycle battle makes the MCP programs blue, Flynn is yellow, Tron is orange, and Ram is red. Thus, it's a bit harder to track who is doing what in the scene at times, and this is one of a handful of scenes where the color scheme runs counter to how the world was built up to this point. The escape from the light cycle area then leads to an action scene with tanks trying to shoot the bikes and failing. Eventually, Flynn, Tron, and Ram escape, locate the central transfer beam they need to get to, and then are distracted by a pool of some sort. This scene takes a bit of time and really doesn't move much of anything forward. Additionally, it's unclear what exactly the pond is meant to be, and they spend a while there just drinking from it. The assumption is that it's an unfiltered connection to the network, as in power or direct information free from the MCP's control, but this is a guess as the characters make only vague references to what it might be. The next several scenes I'm going to machine gun through because there isn't much to say about them in terms of what they add to the overall narrative. Tron leads the team off from the magic pond eventually to get back on mission, and they are split up when Flynn and Ram's bikes are hit by tank fire. This splits up the main team and Tron heads off to the main goal while Flynn carries a dying Ram off to a broken recognizer. Flynn eventually uses his user power to reconstitute the recognizer, Ram dies, and Flynn flies on in the recognizer. Tron locates Yori, Laura's program, and she helps to navigate him toward the input area. Flynn flies around, meets a bit, has some antics, crashes, and eventually knocks out an MCP soldier and turns himself red by touching the guy he knocks out. This whole section was a bit poorly paced, and a lot of time was wasted. We needed to see that Flynn could affect the world in a way that other programs couldn't, highlighting the power of users in this world. That is probably the only important thing that happens here. Ram dies for a bit of drama, and Yori's only real purpose is to be the cute female sidekick, and while she leads Tron about a little, she could have been completely cut out and nothing is really lost. The extended flying bits with the recognizer were more of a tech demo than a necessity. Furthermore, we get a whole back and forth between the bit on the recognizer only to have it trapped on the ship when it crashes. Thus, it was just there for a bit of failed comedy while Flynn bumbles about flying the ship.
I'm fine.
Finally, Flynn turning red is good to use as a camouflage technique, but the connection to the later scene with this makes this really confusing. When he turned red, did some part of him assimilate? Was the MCP affecting him, or was it just to help him blend in? Well, we'll deal with that a bit more in a moment. Next up, Tron and Yori meet Dumont, which is Walter's program, and he allows Tron access to the tower so he can get the information that could take down the MCP. We learned earlier in the film that Walter was one of the original programmers of the NCOM system, and it's a fitting connection to make his program a guardian of the main information tower in the grid. This scene also helps advance the primary objective of the plot, where Alan supplies Tron with the tools and instructions for how to take down the MCP. Thus, this scene was vital to advancing the plot. However, again, Yori's whole contribution was,
Please, Dumont. The guards are coming.
it would have been nice if some aspect of Laura and Walter's relationship was reflected in the relationship between Yori and Dumont, and that is what allowed Tron to pass into the beam. But sadly, that's not what happened. The act ends with a series of scenes where Yori and Tron board a solar sail. Flynn shows up and is nearly knocked to his death by Tron. The group flies the solar sail toward the MCP. Flynn creates a junction, and eventually Flynn and Yori are captured by Sark, and Tron is assumed to be dead. The main aspects of importance here are Yori and Tron learning that Flynn is a user, and that Flynn, again, uses his user power to create a junction to save them. However, there is also an incredibly confusing moment mixed in here. Flynn, in his red disguised form, charges straight at Tron with the other MCP goons, does nothing to announce himself, and is nearly knocked to his death from it. This scene makes no sense. If Flynn was infected by the MCP, it doesn't seem to be messing with his head when he calls out to Tron to pull him up. If he isn't infected by the MCP, why in all hell did he just charge straight at Tron? Overall, this act was a mixture of good and bad developments, with the initial game grid scenes and the scene between Tron, Yori, and Dumont representing some of the stronger moments, and the extended flying sequences representing some of the weaker moments. Taken together, this act gets a 5, because it was a bit below average overall.
There's nothing special about you.
Moving on to Act 3. The final act of the film was quite short, pretty action-packed, and a bit stronger than the second act generally. The act starts off with Flynn and Yori being delivered as prisoners, and Sark joins them, suddenly realizing that Flynn was still alive. Sark leaves Flynn and Yori on the ship to die, while he takes Dumont off to be assimilated to the MCP. Yori starts to give up, assuming that with Tron dead and their fate seemingly sealed, there's no hope left. Flynn revives her, uses his power to keep enough of the ship together to keep them flying toward the MCP, and off below, Tron appears and his data disk returns to him. This leads to a final showdown between Sark and Tron, with Tron winning initially and the MCP needing to transfer all his power to Sark in order to defeat Tron. This turns Sark into a giant, and it seems Tron is hopeless to defeat him. In response to this, Flynn decides to throw himself into the main beam of the MCP, which gives Tron the opening he needs, and he hurls his disc into the heart of the MCP. I've barreled through these points as each one of them was built upon in previous parts of the film. Flynn reviving Yori, saving the ship, and jumping into the beam were logical progressions of his role both as the main protagonist and as the unique user character who could affect the world in ways the other programs couldn't. Tron's battle with Sark fulfills his character role as the warrior and defender of the users, and Sark's loss works as an extension of the idea that Dillinger was the weaker programmer, compared to either Flynn or Alan. Once the MCP had to lend its own power to Sark, Flynn was able to sneak up behind the MCP by jumping into the beam, and together, Flynn and Tron were able to accomplish their goal. The one moment I don't like in this section is when Flynn kisses Yori, because it creates this weird love triangle that honestly makes no sense in the film. While it's true Flynn is playing the brash main protagonist in the film and these characters usually get the girl, Yori, and by extension Laura, is romantically linked to Alan. It's weird that Flynn kisses her romantically, then after he disappears from the program world, she goes off and immediately kisses Tron. It just wasn't necessary, and it felt like a lame attempt at making a dramatic character kiss moment without realizing who the characters were and what their connections to each other and their users were. It's a small point, but it still does more damage than good. The film wraps up with the IO towers turning blue, freedom being restored to the program world, Flynn getting transported back, and the data on Dillinger's theft is printed out. Finally, we get a shot of Alan and Laura on the roof of Incom, waiting for Flynn to show up in a helicopter, seemingly having replaced Dillinger as the head of the company. In general, this was all solid wrapping up of the final plot threads. However, in the current era, one does wonder how far a simple printout of the information would get you in trying to prove Dillinger stole the ideas from Flynn. Overall, the final act was paced rather well, and the scenes did a good job wrapping up the final plot threads. Tron completes his mission with Flynn's help, order is restored, the information is found, and the bad guy is defeated, leaving the audience with a satisfying ending. The only weak points here are the kiss between Flynn and Yori and the question of if that printout really would have been enough evidence to get Dillinger removed. So the final act gets a 7. So that brings me to the end of part 1. So let's take a look at the scores for the plot. So Act 1 got an 8, Act 2 got a 5, and Act 3 got a 7, for a final score of 6.6. Now let's move on to part 2. Part 2. Characters. So we'll go through the main characters first, starting with Kevin Flynn. Kevin Flynn is a typical Maverick archetype. He is cocky, talented, and he plays by his own rules. He was considered the most talented programmer at Incom prior to being let go, and he has talent for designing and playing video games. In fact, several of his game ideas are reflected in how the Incom grid actually functions. For example, Space Paranoids is touted as a particularly popular game he designed, and that game is based on shooting down the recognizers that go around the grid collecting up programs.
And that was my best program.
Flynn's primary motivation in the film is to locate the necessary evidence within the Incom system to expose Dillinger's theft of his video game ideas. Stealing those games allowed Dillinger to rise to senior VP of Incom, while Flynn is left to scrape out a profit from running an arcade where kids pump countless quarters into the games he designed. Thus, he needs proof from the Incom system that Dillinger stole these ideas so he can get the credit he rightfully deserves for their creation of the games. So Flynn's motivation is clearly established and makes sense within the overarching narrative of the film. Moving on to his actions, each action Flynn takes can be linked back to his primary motivation. For example, the first time we see him, he's using Clue, a program he designed to try and hack into Incom and locate files that would prove Dillinger stole his ideas. The next time we see him is when Laura and Alan come to see him about what Dillinger is doing with the MCP, and he goes with them to break into Incom and use Alan's Tron program to help them find the information he needs. Flynn then fights his way through the grid with Tron, ultimately throwing himself into the beam of the MCP to provide Tron with the chance he needs to finally take the MCP down. Thus, everything he does in the film is in service of his motivation to break through the MCP and find evidence of Dillinger's theft, which immediately prints out at a nearby station when Flynn returns from the digital world.
Now we're smoking.
In terms of characterization, all due deference to Jeff Bridges, the performance at times is a bit over the top and leans a bit into campiness. While this might be chalked up to 80s sci-fi action stylization, instances such as his robotic tone during the sequence as Clue, his reaction to being told to kill the program in his first game, no! The regulator flying scene,
Hold it right there.
and his clunky line from the solar sail.
Elementary physics, a beam of energy can always be diverted. Are we there yet, Mommy?
Make his characterization above average at best. So overall, Flynn gets an 8 for motivation and actions, but a 6 for characterization for a 7.3 overall.
Now for some real user power.
Next up is Alan Bradley, or Tron. Alan's character works as a direct contrast to Flynn in many ways, providing the more straight arrow, morally upright, and honorable of the two. This dynamic is established leading up to and culminating in their first scene together, where we get the backstory that Laura is in a relationship with Alan currently, but had previously been in a relationship with Flynn, and the dialogue clearly lays out the character differences between the two men, as Flynn being more the wild type and Alan being the more dependable, steadfast type. This links clearly then to Alan's building of Tron, meant as shorthand for electronic, whose primary purpose is as a defense program for the Incom system. One way to look at this is Flynn builds Clue as an invader, and Alan builds Tron as a defender. While Flynn had good reason to do what he does and to make the program in the way that he does, it does reveal something about each of their personalities.
That's Tron, he fights for the users.
Alan, and by extension his digital presence as Tron, is motivated by a desire to secure the INCOM system and ensure the integrity of the programs housed within it. Tron is also described by Ram as a program that fights for the users. In that way, Tron is trying to defend the programs written by the users from being assimilated by Sark and the MCP, and also trying to make sure the MCP isn't dealing with data it shouldn't be. Thus, Alan's motivation to secure the INCOM system is fairly clear from his introduction.
Let's move on.
Alan's main actions also work in service of defending the integrity of the INCOM system. First, this was his entire purpose in designing Tron. Then, when he learns that his access has been denied and why, he helps Flynn get into INCOM and provides Tron with the information it will need to finally remove the MCP. As Tron, Alan is portrayed from the outset as a capable fighter in the game's grid, which is a reflection of Alan's claims of Tron being the strongest defense program ever written. There is also a good moment that highlights Tron's singular focus after the characters find the direct source. Ram and Flynn seem happy to just hang out and keep indulging, but as soon as Tron gets a signal from Alan, he immediately calls for them to move out. He is also able to take down several of the MCP drones as well as Sark in their initial battle. Taken together, it's clear to see that everything Alan does, both in the living world and in the grid as Tron, are in service of his motivation to secure and defend the system. In terms of characterization, Bruce Boxleitner's performance was adequate. The issue here is almost the opposite of the issue with the way that Bridges brought Flynn to life. The performance here by Boxleitner is almost too subdued and quite monotone. He comes off in nearly every scene as the Boy Scout. While some might argue that their grid versions are meant to be more robotic in a sense, there really isn't much difference in the delivery between Alan and Tron. Their tone and overall reactions to nearly every situation is very monotone. Overall, Alan and Tron get the same score as Flynn, with 8s for motivation and actions and a 6 for characterization, making a final score of 7.3.
How did you do that?
Next up is Dillinger. Dillinger is an arrogant, power-hungry programmer and businessman who rose to the top of the INCOM company by stealing Flynn's ideas for several video games. He's said to not be too bright or particularly adept at programming, but he makes up for this with ambition and deviousness.
Cute.
End of line.
Dillinger's main motivation in the film is to keep Flynn, and anyone else for that matter, from tampering with the MCP and finding data on his theft of Flynn's ideas. It's also set up through the film that he's basically become subordinate to the MCP, a program he wrote, because he allowed the program to grow beyond his ability to control. Thus, as his primary goal is to ensure no one finds out about his theft, he is forced to allow the MCP to do what it wants because it threatens to share the information that would expose his double cross of Flynn. This comes across even stronger as the Sark version of the character, which is the grid manifestation of Dillinger, who the MCP routinely pushes around and tortures to an extent. Sark is the MCP's main henchman, and his motivation here is to do what the MCP wills him to save from being punished. So there is a good establishment of both what Dillinger wants most and how that desire is linked to the version of him that exists on the grid. In terms of actions, Dillinger tasked the MCP with locating and destroying the incriminating data and then proceeded to cover up the actions of the MCP by shutting down access that would allow other programmers to find it. As Sark, he wants most to simply kill Flynn and almost does so, and the only thing that stopped him was his fear of the MCP. Otherwise, he does as he is bade by the MCP throughout, and his subservience is consistent with his motivation. Dillinger doesn't want the information of his theft to get out, so he does what the MCP wants to make sure that doesn't happen. Sark, by extension, doesn't want to be punished by the MCP either, so he does what he's told. In both instances, the actions are linked to the same primary motivation.
Maybe I should keep you around just to make me laugh.
Finally, for characterization, this is one of the rare cases in this film where the actor was able to show a slightly wider range of emotion and depth without going overboard. When David Warner is interacting with the MCP, he comes off a bit meek and timid. But when he interacts with Alan, Walter, or Flynn, he comes off as assertive and confident. He's able to shift back and forth between these two representations quite well, and the balance between the two was more interesting. Particularly in the moments where the balance seemed about to crack, such as when he realized at the start of Act 3 that Flynn is still alive.
Nothing.
His panic rises, and we get that teetering between fear and rage that comes off quite well. All in all, the characterization of Dillinger and Sark we're good, so this gets an 8. That means that Dillinger gets a combined score of 8s, with 8s all around for motivation, actions, and characterization.
You'll regret this.
Now I'm going to move on to briefly cover the supporting characters. So first up is Laura Baines, or Yori when she's on the grid. This is Alan's current girlfriend and Flynn's ex-girlfriend who works as an input-output program on the grid and is part of a team with Walter Gibbs developing Incom's digitization laser. Sadly, Laura is a plot device that really doesn't add much character-wise. She's there to bounce between the two men, and the film makes a really odd decision to have her kiss Flynn right before he jumps into the beam at the end, and then Tron mere moments later, which highlights the confusing purpose she's meant to serve. She facilitates getting Alan to Flynn, then almost has a moment of being the person with the keys to the building for the heist, but apparently those were just the keys to her car.
Shall we dance?
Flynn needs her computer and she starts up the solar sail, but none of these things are really character moments. She's just there to be the girl the two boys are kind of sharing in a weird way. I mean, if you think about Laura's motivation, what would you classify it as? To be helpful? To help the guys? To help them out? I honestly don't know. Furthermore, much like Boxlighter, Cindy Morgan's characterization of Laura and Yori is very monotone. Spacey and disconnected is probably the best way to describe it. Thus, Laura and Yori's contribution to the film gets a 4. It was rather poor.
What good will that do?
Walter Gibbs, on the other hand, for as little as he was in the film, brought a few really important moments. In particular, one of the most vital world-building moments comes with this line.
You know, you can remove men like Alan and me from the system, but we helped create it. And our spirit remains in every program we design for this computer.
And his whimsical explanation of how the digitization laser functioned was also interesting.
Well, what I meant was...
Actually, what we propose to do is to change something into nothing and back again. They might just as well have said, here goes something, here comes nothing.
Right.
His main contribution to the film was to stand in as one of the original programmers who designed the system, to explain to us the connection between the users and their programs, and to be, in a sense, a kind of oracle in the grid to help the heroes obtain the final piece of information they needed to defeat the bad guy. He has some good functional moments, and Bernard Hughes' whimsical yet wise old man delivery was quite good. So Gibbs gets an 8. He was a good addition to the film.
You may pass, my friend.
Finally then, we have Ram, who appears in the human form as one of Alan's co-workers seeking to get at his sweet, sweet popcorn, and he exists as a conduit for explaining the grid and the overall status of the situation there to Flynn, and also as an emotional moment when he de-resolutes. He serves this function well enough, but he doesn't do or say anything impactful enough to warrant deeper analysis. The characterization was also unremarkable in either a good or bad way. Thus, Ram gets a 6. He was adequate, but unexceptional.
I hope you make it.
So with Laura getting a 4, Walter getting an 8, and Ram getting a 6, the supporting cast gets a 6 overall. So that brings me to the end of part 2. So let's look at the final scores for the character section. So Kevin Flynn got a 7.3, Alan Bradley got a 7.3, Dillinger got an 8, and the supporting cast got a 6, for a final score of 7.15. Part 3. World Building. For world building, I often start in an unconventional manner by asking some basic questions to ensure the film has provided the underlying framework for the world the story takes place in. So the first questions I focus on are, who are these characters? Where are these characters? When does this story take place? What are these characters doing, and what, if any, special rules are there to this world? And finally, why are these characters doing what they are doing? Having said that, let's quickly go through these. So first up, who are these characters? Well, they are computer programmers who are either working for or have worked for Incom, which is a computer programming and defense contracting company. Establishing this establishes the things the characters are capable of, both in the real world and on the grid. To add to this, Flynn in particular is a game designer, making him particularly skilled at gaming.
I play video games better than anybody.
Now, where are these characters? At the outset, the characters are in the world we live in. From Act 2 on, they are on the grid, which is a digital representation of the computer network where one supervisory program is trying to subjugate all the other programs. This setup is important for understanding how the digital world reflects the real world in a particular sense. It has buildings and people, but the people are programs created by users, and thus the people you see on the grid are human-looking manifestations of the programs designed by users in the real world, and these programs often take on traits and beliefs of their creators or of their users. So next, when does this story take place? The story seems to take place in the era it was made, namely the 1980s in the United States. Thus, there is no assumption of future tech, and the basic rules of computer technology and what it can do are more or less tied to that era, save for how the grid works, which I will address in a moment. Moving on then, what are these characters doing? Well, Alan, Flynn, and Laura are trying to access data that would expose Dillinger for his theft of Flynn's game ideas. Dillinger, on the other hand, is trying to prevent that. So this leads into why they are doing these things, which for Dillinger, it's to maintain his role as the senior VP of Incom. For Alan and Laura, they want the Incom system to be freed from Dillinger's control and secured in a more ethical way. For Flynn, he wants credit for the work he did.
You realize I can't allow this?
Now, all that said, this gives us a good framework for who these characters are, the world they live in, what they are doing there, and why they are doing it. That brings us to the more fundamental and crucial aspect of world building in Tron, which is the grid, which will address the special rules question. The first question to consider is how something or someone can be transported to and from the grid in this film. This is set up rather well in the first act by an exchange between Laura and Walter, where Walter explains exactly how the digitization experiment they are conducting works, and how it is connected to the laser. So Flynn is transported to the grid through this laser. The film provides just enough information here for audiences to understand how this would basically work without over-explaining it. Oftentimes, in cases such as this, the more a film tries to explain how something like this works, the more questions it creates, and the explanation often leads to the idea falling apart. Thus, with complex ideas such as digitizing a human into a computer world, the simpler the explanation, the better. Knowing now how Flynn exists on the grid, it's important to note that he is the only digital human on the grid. Yet there are versions of all the main characters on the grid as well, namely Alan as Tron, Laura as Yori, Dillinger as Sark, and Walter as Dumont. The film also does a great job of explaining how this works with that wonderful line of dialogue from Walter I've highlighted twice already, but we'll touch on it again.
And our spirit remains in every program we design for this computer.
This explains why the programs look like their users, because some part of them exists in every program they write. The next thing to examine is the use of color and how it delineates, in most cases, the conflict on the grid. For most of the film, the free programs are represented in blue, and the programs that have been assimilated by the MCP are red. There are some scenes, however, most notably in the light cycle battle, where the MCP light cycles are blue, Flynn's is yellow, Tron's is orange, and Ram's is red. This can be tied to a late change to the script where the coloring scheme was changed from free programs being colored yellow and MCP programs being colored blue, with scenes such as the light cycle battle retaining the original color scheme. This change can make a few scenes a bit hard to keep track of which characters are loyal to which side, particularly because of how the backlighting drowns out a lot of details purposefully to make the coloring scheme stand out more. Still, the instances of the color switch are rare, and for the vast majority of the film, they use the red and blue color scheme to clearly differentiate between the free programs and the MCP assimilated programs. The visual cue also helps the audience recognize when a program is being assimilated. However, the one moment where it becomes unclear is when Flynn takes on a red hue, which I covered in the plot section and will go into in a bit more depth later in this section as well.
We're getting closer.
The next important factor is that Flynn is granted abilities that other programs are not capable of because he is a digital human on the grid rather than a program. The examples of this are his reconstruction of the recognizer, when he creates the junction on the solar sail, his ability to keep part of Sark's ship from derezzing, and when he jumps into the MCP's main beam at the end of the third act. The film sets this up well, with the first instance of Flynn reconstituting the recognizer without intending to, and the justification is immediately clear to Ram why Flynn was able to do that. This power then continues to help Flynn guide Tron to the MCP so that they can complete their task, and it is utilized in logical ways to help them overcome obstacles or difficult situations, but not so flippantly as to feel like a Deus Ex Machina type power that can solve any and all problems. The one area where the abilities are unclear is during the light cycle battle. It would have made more sense and could have connected back to Flynn more clearly if Flynn were in fact the one that crashed the MCP light cycle into the wall, because it could have been justified by saying he has the power to impact the world in ways other programs can't.
I'm what you guys call a user.
Furthermore, his knowledge of the system and the light cycle program in particular would make the fact that the hole that is created was right where it needed to be to facilitate their escape. The final aspect to touch on is how assimilation works. The MCP, and by extension the programs assimilated or loyal to it, are trying to pressure the free programs to basically either join them or be destroyed. One way they do this is by throwing them into the games. During the explanation for the games, Sark explains that if they join willingly, they might be able to join the higher ranks of the MCP. However, if they continue to show loyalty to their users, they will not receive training and be forced to battle stronger opponents in the games.
That will be all.
In essence, this could be seen like a hacker or computer virus brutalizing programs until they eventually break down. Again, the film makes good use of the color scheme to highlight the process of assimilation. The only area where this is a bit unclear is when Flynn turns red after taking down one of the MCP drones before rejoining Tron and Yori on the solar sail. As I discussed in the plot section, it is unclear if the color change for Flynn actually affected his personality or not, or if it was simply a convenient method of camouflage. Overall, the world building in the original Tron was quite strong. They established the rules of the grid quite well, particularly what the two sides of the internal conflict were, how the programs manifested in human form and how that accounted for their personalities, the way in which the colors were used and what they represented, the powers that a program had compared to a digital human, and how the MCP was forcibly taking over other programs or outright deleting them. Thus, the world building in Tron gets an 8. It was good.
Well, it's called Tron. It's a security program itself, actually.
Part 4. Themes. There are 3 primary themes I want to touch on that I think were particularly prevalent in this film, and the first is oppression and defiance. As I said in the introduction, Tron in many ways was the precursor to films like The Matrix, and much like The Matrix, one of the primary themes is the conflict between an oppressive system that is looking to strip away personal freedom and the individuals who dare to defy that system and fight to free their brethren from the oppressors. This theme is well established from the outset on the grid, where programs are taken away from their primary tasks and thrust into a lose-lose situation where they either surrender their freedom or are forced into a kind of mortal combat from which there is no victory. The film then shows us through dialogue from Ram and the actions of Tron that the programs are aware of their users, but refer to them almost like deities that exist as creators in another realm. Thus, there is also an underlying theme of faith that ties into the oppression as well, where programs are being asked to abandon their belief in their users or their creators and join the MCP and be assimilated. Also, even using the word assimilation seems to insinuate a loss of individuality. You then have characters like Tron and Dumont who choose to resist and defy their suppression in the name of setting the others free. The theme also stretches back to the outset of the film as well, where Dillinger, and by extension the MCP, suppress access to the Encom network, and that directly leads to Alan and Laura seeking out Flynn to liberate the information they need to free the system. All in all, this theme was well established through character motivations as well as the primary conflict of the film, making it one of the stronger parts of the overall narrative. The second theme that stood out was the representation of human existence in a digital world. While we are incapable of being physically present in a digital space, many might argue that this film began to breach a question that has become even more prevalent in the current digital age. The question of what an online presence means and how it impacts the way that humans interact with the physical world at times. In Tron, the programs that users design manifest on the grid with their creator's image, and in most instances seem to take on exaggerated representations of their creator's personality as well. For example, Alan is an upright and steadfast character, and these characteristics are amplified in Tron, making him a strong representation of the righteous hero archetype, while Dillinger's petty, weak, and insecure traits get amplified in Sark.
Busy dying, you worn-out excuse for an old program.
Thus, whoever they are in the physical world, the most prevalent part of their personality gets amplified in their digital form. Many might argue that this is often true of people in the current age, that our digital personalities on SNS or in virtual spaces is an exaggerated and amplified version of our best or worst traits. It's also interesting to consider the connections between the creators and the creations and their actions as well. For instance, Dillinger rose to his position through the theft of Flynn's ideas. The MCP, which was written by Dillinger, rose to power the same way, by commandeering other programs and forcing them to become part of him or part of his own program.
Take that program to the holding pit!
Thus, within this theme, there also seems to be a link being established between creators and their creations. Again, another well fleshed out theme that helped to establish important aspects of world building, namely how a user's program might be influenced by the creator, as well as providing support for character actions and personality on the grid. Finally, there is the messianic theme of savior or liberator coming in from the outside to set the captives free. Again, this theme functions much like Neo's role in the Matrix. There is one special character who can do things the others cannot, who has to ultimately sacrifice himself for the final enemy to be defeated. In Tron, this is a crucial part of Flynn's character arc and is built into the idea that, as a user, he can do things the other programs cannot. Interestingly, Flynn's sacrifice doesn't lead to death, and it ultimately is done in order to pave the way for Tron to make the killing blow. Though to the programs it might seem that Flynn's jump potentially killed him because he is sent back to the living world once Tron defeats the MCP. Nevertheless, there is a combination of factors here where the savior character in Flynn is acting more like a conduit for the programs to free themselves. Of the main themes, this was the least interesting and makes the decision for Flynn to kiss Yori slightly more awkward. The idea that the creations were loyal to their individual creators works a bit better narratively because one could imagine the programs like a user's child in a sense. Making them suddenly loyal to one particular savior user feels like the story is trying too hard to make Flynn the hero, which is odd when one considers the title of the film. According to an interview with Media Mics in 2011, Bonnie McBird, the second credited writer on the film, noted that Steven Lisberger, the director and main screenplay and story writer, gradually drew the movie into a more serious tone with quasi-religious overtones. While the actual science stuff, which I spent a lot of time embedding and which I still think would have delightfully resonated with then and today's tech audience, was pretty much completely omitted. Thus, it seems this is a direction the main creator felt was best for the film, but ultimately it ended up being the weakest thematic link overall because it overemphasized Flynn's character as the savior of the film.
Hey, there's been a mistake. I gotta see the guy in charge.
In summary, the themes of oppression and defiance, as well as the theme of human existence in a digital world, were two of the strongest aspects of the film. The themes also supported and bolstered aspects of the narrative through plot, character, and world building. Thus, each of these themes gets a 9. However, the quasi-religious messianic theme was a bit weaker and ultimately skewed some of the world building elements by making Flynn the user placed above all other users, so it gets a 6. Taken together, the overall score for the themes in Tron was an 8. They were good.
Games. You want games? I'll give you games.
Part 5. Architects. In this section, I want to briefly touch on the architects of this film to highlight the minds behind its creation. So, starting with the director, main story, and screenplay writer, Steven Lisberger, and apologies if I pronounced that wrong. Lisberger started off in Hollywood by winning a Student Academy Award in 1973 for Cosmic Cartoon, and then moved on to producing commercials and title sequences before working on an animated film for the 1980s Olympics with his business partner and the main producer of Tron, Donald Kushner. Tron, then, was Lisberger's first feature film, and by far his most popular. In 1987, he went on to direct Hot Pursuit, and then he directed Slipstream in 1989, but both of those films were critical and financial failures. Thus, it seems Lisberger, for whatever can be said of Tron as a cult classic, was a one-hit wonder as a director. The second credited writer for Tron was Bonnie McBird, who worked as a script developer through the 1970s and 80s. During her work on writing the Tron script, she was brought together with Alan Kay, a man credited with leading the design and development of the first modern windowed computer desktop interface. And not only did she design the character of Alan and Tron around Kay, but she also ended up marrying Kay. Happily, it seems the pair are still married to this day, which is a heartwarming extra layer to the backstory of Tron.
Beautiful!
McBird's main writing activities now are with HarperCollins, writing a Sherlock Holmes adventure series. Sadly, as was hinted at earlier, the writing process of Tron was a bit tumultuous, and the accreditation of the script was contentious. According to McBird in the Media Mike's interview, "I did 8 drafts of the script and something like 14 outlines. One of my later drafts is the one Disney bought, but there were 8 sets of writers after me. The credits went to arbitration, and the WGA awarded me credit." In another interview with Tron Sector in 2002, she noted that, "I did many complete drafts of the screenplay. I consider myself the original writer of the movie. Tron was the name of a glowing character he, Steven Lisberger, had created for a radio ad. I came up with the idea of a guy who falls inside a computer, meets a video game warrior, and with his help, escapes. So it seems that, at least according to McBird, she was responsible for the primary framework, but much of the dialogue and the plot development were decisions made by Lisberger and a team of 8 or so other people. One aspect noted by McBird in particular seems to highlight some of the issues in Act 2 of the plot. McBird said, "But Steven and I eventually had creative differences. His input in the form of notes was at the beginning both helpful and inspiring, but later became, now add a pirate ship and make this work. And we found it increasingly difficult to communicate. He's always been enormously visually talented and has a sense of great moments, but it was never a co-writing situation. Repeatedly, I found myself insisting on motivating and supporting the terrific action sequences with strong character and story logic. But the effects took precedence, and Steven began to steer the tone into a different place. So it seems that, at least according to McBird, Lisberger was more focused on creating the visual moments of the film rather than thinking about how those moments would arise organically through the narrative."
Mr. Dillinger, I'm so very disappointed in you.
Moving on to the producer, we have Donald Kushner. Tron was one of the first films Kushner produced, but he has gone on to produce over 100 films since. Some highlights being The Brave Little Toaster in 1987, Monster in 2003, Tron Legacy in 2010, and Blitz in 2011. However, looking at his extensive backlog, the majority of films he has produced tend to rank somewhere below a 5.0 on IMDb, meaning he has been prolific, but his work isn't generally of the highest quality. Next, I want to touch on the cinematographer, Bruce Logan. Logan has an incredible pedigree in the sci-fi world, having designed effects for 2 of the foundational films of the sci-fi genre in mainstream cinema, namely 2001: A Space Odyssey and Star Wars: A New Hope. If we add Tron into this mix, we can see that Logan made a significant contribution to the film industry when it comes to visual effects and cinematography, as all of these films were highly touted at the time and to this day for their innovative and impressive visual effects. Unfortunately, Tron was barred from consideration at the 55th Academy Awards because the members thought that using computers was a form of cheating when creating visual effects. However, it was up against some incredible competition in E.T., Blade Runner, and Poltergeist, so there was a strong possibility it would not have won. But it is a shame, nevertheless, that Logan's work on the visuals in this film were not at least recognized as a nominee. Finally, on a sad note, Bruce Logan passed away in April of this year, but hopefully, his legacy and contributions to the advancement of visual effects in film will live on for generations to come. The next person I will examine is Jeff Gorson, the editor for Tron. Gorson has a rather long history as an editor in Hollywood, editing films such as Flight of the Navigator, Can't Buy Me Love, and Big Top Pee-wee in the late 80s, and then working on several of the Adam Sandler and Rob Schneider films through the 90s and early 2000s. Gorson also won 3 Emmys for his production work on the television show Quantum Leap, a show that I truly love. On the TV front, Gorson also worked as an editor on Airwolf and Magnum P.I. Taken together, Gorson seems to have achieved a lot of success both as a producer and an editor, but outside of Quantum Leap, the projects he worked on don't really seem to link back tonally or thematically with Tron. Most of his work is in straight-up comedies, and that was where he was most successful. Furthermore, most of his hits seem to have come from television rather than feature films. Now, I don't feel qualified enough as a novice editor myself to comment on the editing of Tron, but I think it's at least worth noting the discrepancy in the general kinds of films he edited that were more successful and how they were both tonally and visually much different than Tron.
That was uncalled for.
Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the music from Tron. The main music tracks in the film were created by Wendy Carlos, who along with being a musician in their own right, was primarily noted for their work with Stanley Kubrick and more specifically the music for A Clockwork Orange and The Shining. Carlos was also known for contributions in the development of the Moog synthesizer electronic keyboard. With that in mind, it's easy to link the unique sounds of the music in A Clockwork Orange, The Shining, and Tron because the instrument Carlos used had a very singular sound. However, the sounds and style of music fit the mood and tone of the Kubrick films much more than they did in Tron. The synthesizer in Carlos's style has a rather unsettling and otherworldly vibe to it, and while Tron is meant to feel otherworldly, it's not like the nightmare type realm of The Shining or the hyper-violent world of Clockwork. In other words, the music feels tonally off in some scenes, creating an unsettling vibe at times when the scene doesn't really call for it. That brings me to the end of my overview of the architects for Tron, and now let's move on to part 6. Part 6. Critical and Financial Performance. Starting off with the critical response to Tron, I pulled scores from both Rotten Tomatoes and Metacritic, and I will attempt to explain the interpretation of each along with the score. First, the review average according to critics on Rotten Tomatoes is 74%, which is based on 72 reviews. What that means is that there is a 74% chance that the average critic will rate the film at least 5.6 out of 10. Another way of looking at this is the percent chance of getting a particular outcome from a dichotomous pair, above or below average. As Rotten Tomatoes is only interested in the positive of the pair, meaning the above average response, the percent represents the probability of a reviewer coming to the above average conclusion. In sum, if 100 critics went to see Tron, the assumption is that approximately 74 of them would rate the film at least 5.6 out of 10. However, it should be obvious here that there is no difference within the Rotten Tomatoes score if all 74 of them rated the film 5.6 out of 10 versus all 74 of them rating it a full 10 out of 10. So it's basically just telling you how likely it is that the critics will be more pleased than not with the film, but not the degree to which they were pleased with the film.
Frustrating.
That said, moving on to the Metacritic rating, we have a score of 58. The score is based on only 13 reviews, with 6 positive reviews and 7 mixed reviews. According to Metacritic, their scores are determined by curating a diverse group of highly respected critics, assigning scores to their reviews, and then creating a weighted average of those scores into a single score on a scale of 100. Thus, the 58 seems to indicate that the average critic review, according to Metacritic's methodology, was 5.8. Taken together, it seems possible that the average score of the 74 critics in the Rotten Tomatoes example might have been around 5.8.
No!
Okay, so how about with audiences? Moving back to Rotten Tomatoes, we have an audience score of 69%, based on over 50,000 ratings, which indicates a 69% chance that the average audience member will rate the film above average. This is interesting in that it seems critics were more pleased with the film than audiences according to Rotten Tomatoes. In recent history, particularly with Disney properties on Rotten Tomatoes, the trend is usually reversed, where audiences rate them significantly higher than critics. There is a reason for that, but that is a topic for another day. On Metacritic, the audience score for Tron was 6.7, based on 67 reviews, with 41 positive, 21 mixed, and 5 negative. And then on IMDb, the score was also 6.7, based on 135,000 reviews. In summary, it seems critics, on average, rated Tron around a 6, and audiences rated it closer to, but not quite, a 7. Thus, according to my scale, that would be just above average to adequate.
All right, Yuri. All right.
Moving on to the financial performance, the reported budget for Tron was $17 million, and the box office, according to thenumbers.com, was $29 million. According to Box Office Mojo, it was $33 million. Then you have Wikipedia claiming it made $50 million. Of the three, Wikipedia is the least reliable, and as the article directly linking this $50 million claim cannot be accessed, that will be discounted. My instinct is to go with the data from thenumbers.com, but I will provide results from both remaining sites in the name of thoroughness. So, instead of attempting to adjust for inflation, the way I prefer to analyze performance is to calculate the profit margin of the film in order to see how it performed based on comparing how much they spent to produce and market the film compared to how much money the film made at the box office. Additionally, as reported, budgets do not account for either the costs of marketing the film or the cut the movie theaters take from the box office totals. The standard calculation in the current era is to multiply the reported budget by 2.5 and then run the calculation. As this was 1982, I'm going to assume a slightly cheaper marketing cost and a smaller cut from theaters and just multiply the budget by 1.5. If there is a compelling argument for a different multiplier for 80s era films, please drop it in the comments and let me know. Now, having said that, with a reported budget of $17 million and an assumed box office of $29 million from thenumbers.com, we are looking at a profit margin of 5%. That means that 5 cents went to Disney for every dollar of box office profit. If we use the figure from Box Office Mojo, the profit margin increases to 23%, meaning Disney received 23 cents for each dollar of box office profit. Whichever figure you choose, this film did not perform well financially.
Wait, what are you saying now?
If we take these two factors together now, meaning the critical performance and the financial performance, Tron was a poorly performing film both critically and financially. While that might not encapsulate the quality of the film, it is important to consider in the grander scheme of its lasting cultural impact. I think this clearly shows potentially how and why it has been relegated to cult status. There is something about this film that strongly resonates with a particular audience of people, but it does not seem to be the kind of film that connects with a wider audience. Now, with that said, let's move on to the final section.
Ready? Ready.
Part 7. Conclusion. Tron was a landmark film for the sci-fi genre, and it is often credited as one of the most important films for the development and spread of computer graphics in mainstream media. Narratively, it had some really strong thematic elements, particularly with the concepts of oppression and resistance, as well as human existence in a digital world. The second theme in particular has become a more prevalent question in the modern era as concerns for the seemingly sudden influx of AI into nearly every aspect of art and technology, and the ever-growing spread of creating digital representations of oneself through social media appear ubiquitous. Tron provides an interesting insight into how humans might transpose themselves into a digital world, seeming to argue that this transition would heighten the most prominent aspects of our personalities, creating an exaggerated representation of who we are. Furthermore, that this exaggeration could work with both good and bad traits, creating an equal opportunity for our digital selves to either manifest as Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde. Where the film falls a bit short is in the second act of the plot and some of the character development. It would seem, if we are to believe Bonnie McBird's comments about Liz Berger prioritizing the technological aspects, or the concepts he wanted to include visually ahead of the narrative, might have done some amount of damage to the overall story. In other words, rather than creating the scenes as they arose organically from the narrative, there might have been an attempt at creating the scenes first and then forcing them into the story. The proverbial cart before the horse problem.
Who does he calculate he is?
Thus, while Tron will always hold a special place in the annals of film for its innovative visuals and pioneering use of computer graphics, it seems the director might have been focused too much on that particular portion of the film to the detriment of the core narrative. With that said, I will wrap up this review of Tron with my final score. So, the plot got a 6.6, the characters got a 7.3, the world building got an 8, the themes got an 8, for a final score of 7.4. Thank you very much for listening, and I will catch you in the next one.